In August of 2011, my oldest brother, Richard, was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. In November of that year, while studying in a class on neuroscience at Princeton Theological Seminary, my phone started to vibrate, and I saw that my brother was calling me. Given my brother's situation, I always took the calls. I slipped out of the classroom and answered the phone to hear the voice of my sister-in-law, who sounded very bubbly and upbeat. She said, "Hi, Reggie, your brother wants to speak with you. I'm going to give him the phone." When my brother came on the line, he didn't say hello or how are you doing, but immediately asked me, "Do you believe in God?" I trust you can imagine that this question took me by surprise, and I immediately responded, "Have I said or done something to make you think otherwise?" He related that he had been searching for God and had been unable to find God, and what he was experiencing since he was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. He said that people had been telling him that God was going to bless him and that he had not experienced any blessings. I remarked that I had read some of the notes on his Facebook page and that I thought there was a lot of poor theology being given expression on his Facebook page. A lot of people had written in ways that would have led you to believe that having brain cancer was a great thing because it was going to bring all these blessings. Kate Bowler, in her book, Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies That I've Loved, describes a similar experience. I'll remind you that she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer and told to get her affairs in order. She shares, "Most everyone I meet is dying to make me certain. They want me to know without a doubt that there's a hidden logic to this seeming chaos. Even when I was still in the hospital, a neighbor came to the door and told my husband that everything happens for a reason." "I'd love to hear it," he replied. "Pardon," she said, startled. "The reason my wife is dying," he said, in that sweet and sour way he has, effectively ending the conversation as the neighbor stammered something and handed him a casserole. As that phone call with my brother progressed that November day in 2011, he went on to relate that he had been looking for God, waiting on God to speak in some way, and that it just hadn't happened. It was evident that he was in a state of despair. I told him that I knew that it was a difficult place, a painful place to be. I shared that theologians call such experiences the dark night of the soul or the silence of God. I related that I did not think that there was an easy resolution to what he was experiencing, and I warned him about trying to resolve it too easily. I suggested that he needed to wait in that dark place. And I told him that I did not know of any way to help him find God in that place. I shared that his only hope was that God would find him. That I didn't know of any technique for getting God to do what we may desperately want God to do. I also shared my conviction that his despair and darkness might actually be inviting him into a deeper relationship with God if he had the perseverance to resist what I call the butterflies and roses theology. That is, everything's going to come up roses or come out butterflies. I told him I knew of nothing harder than waiting for God. Advent is a time when the church invites us to think about how there is nothing harder than waiting for God. Much of the biblical text is about people of faith waiting for God. And I think it's fair to say that God is typically slow. I've spent time in churches that say God's always on time, but my own experience is that God usually shows up late. That is, much later than I want, and rarely in a way that I would have expected or predicted. I'll preach more about this in a couple of weeks, but think about God showing up in a feeding trough, in a barn, in a backward village, in a backward country, in the form of a baby. Anyone making up a religious tradition would never come up with that one. And the people have been waiting for God, not just months or years or decades, but centuries. All of this is hard for those of us who live in an instant gratification culture where I pass through the drive-thru or hit a few buttons on my microwave. Let me go 5 or 10 minutes past the hour in a worship service, and you can be sure that I'm going to be reminded that I was too slow about wrapping up our religious fix for the week, to which most of us devote all of 1 hour. We want what we want, and we want even what we don't want now, right away. I've got people at the bank and at the stores apologizing about making me wait. I'm not sure that they mean it, but I'm quite certain that there's never an apology in the biblical text for making people wait. So as we think about the meaning of the Advent season, the church is not just talking about the number of shopping days left before Christmas, but about waiting for God and how very hard that can be. Our reading from Psalm 13 is a startling reminder about how very hard waiting for God can be. The psalmist cries out in anguish, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long?" We know that the Bible teaches us that God never leaves us or forsakes us. So the psalmist isn't suggesting that God forgets us, but rather it gives expression to the anguish that people of faith will experience at times when they find themselves waiting for God. The psalmist is not attempting to articulate a theological doctrine, but rather demonstrate what an authentic relationship with God will look like at times in our lives. Throughout the biblical text, we find people crying out in anguish as expressions of faith. Most notably our Lord, who cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It isn't that God has forsaken us, but rather an expression of a relationship in which there is complete honesty. We all put on a lot of pretense when we come to church or go to the hospital or find ourselves at the funeral home, passing out cliches like they are theological candy, sweet, but no substance. The biblical text models something very differently, and it can make us uncomfortable. The truth usually does. Bishop Willimon observes, read the Bible, and you will note that about a third of Scripture involves the pain of people waiting for God to come. So, what are we to make of this pain of waiting for God? How are we to understand it? What are we to do with it? As I suggested to my brother, and as I've suggested to some of you, a crisis of faith may be the beginning of a whole different understanding of God if we're not too quick to try to fix it, but persevere in waiting for God. Thomas More told about his cousin who was a nun who had this kind of spiritual growth by entering into the despair rather than trying to evade it. He writes, "A cousin of mine who was a nun once confided in me her story of an immense struggle of faith. An early bloomer in spirituality, she had entered the convent young and then spent years living that life enthusiastically. With her unbounded idealism and ever-present intellectual curiosity, she studied the religious life and always sought to make it more intense and up-to-date. But she also had a practical, no-nonsense aspect that tempered her sweetness. Whenever she talked about theology or meditation or education, she would laugh heartily, like a spiritual teacher who always perceives the ironies and absurdities of this life. One day she discovered she had a rare, painful, and fatal disease. Gradually, she had to give up her teaching and spend more time just taking care of her body. For several years, she suffered intense physical pain and discomfort. She would go from one doctor to the next, gathering a few new pieces of information about her unusual condition. At one point, she probably knew more about her disease than any doctor in the country. Characteristically, she arranged her life the best way she could. She studied her illness and developed her own regimens of self-care. Then, in the midst of her illness, pain and disruption in her life took their full toll. She lost her faith. This was someone who had spent her entire life cultivating her spirituality and giving herself completely to her religion. She told me that she had become profoundly depressed during one of her hospitalizations. Everything she had believed collapsed into a deep, dark hole. And she felt that all of her previous efforts to live an honest, principled life had been in vain. She called for a priest, but rather astonishingly, when she told him of her loss of faith, he dashed out of her room. She said she long remembered the image of his back as he hurriedly pushed open the door to get away from her doubt and depression. She had no choice then but to sink into her black emotion. She had never thought in all of her years of studies and training and spirituality that she would have such a crisis of faith. She had expected a continual ascent in understanding and technique, with maybe a few small, surmountable problems here and there. But her fate led her in a different direction, to a place of void of spirit and dominated by utter hopelessness. She was led deep inside of herself, to the very edge of the person she knew herself to be, emptied of all spiritual ambition and all satisfaction in what she had accomplished. She had no guides, no hints, She knew not where to go next. She had no life in front of her and no one to talk to. But she told me, eventually, she discovered a new kind of faith that rose directly out of her depressive thoughts and emotions. She was shocked to feel it stir in that deep, empty pit. She didn't know what to think of it because it was so different from the kind of faith that she had been learning about and nurturing all of her life. It was inseparable from her illness and incapacity. Within this brand new form of spirituality, she discovered a profound peace. She no longer craved comfort from the hospital chaplain or anyone else. She said she found it difficult to describe this new trust that she felt because it was so deep and so different from the faith that she had been cultivating in her previous spiritual practices. She had found what she needed the only way she could, alone. Not long after she told me the story of her loss and recovery of faith, Moore writes, she died peacefully. Reflecting on the story, Moore writes, she had to learn that faith comes not only from the spiritual life and from high revelations, it also comes from an emanation from the depths. She learned, I think, the lesson taught by many mystics, that this necessary dimension of faith is spawned by unknowing. Nicholas of Cusa said that we have to be educated into our ignorance, or else the full presence of the divine will be kept at bay. We have to arrive at that difficult point where we don't know what's going on or what we can do. That precise point is an opening to true faith. After that November call from my brother, I traveled to Indiana in December, just before Christmas, to see him. We would have conversations between his naps. I had decided that I was not going to bring up that phone call before making the trip, but he brought it up when he awoke from one of his naps. He asked, "Do you remember that phone call when I was in despair saying that I couldn't find God?" I said I remembered. "Well," he said, "I want you to know that I have found God." "Is that right?" I commented. "Yeah," he continued. "It was really profound and touched me very deeply." I didn't say anything. You don't need to say anything in a moment like that. And I waited for him to continue. He said it happened the first time that he went back to his church. He said that the people in the church were coming up and telling him that they were glad to see him and asking him how he was doing. They weren't doing any theological interpretation like so many had done while he was down in the bed, telling him how God was going to use his experience to bless him. No. They were simply coming up and expressing their love for him. He said that the people had a glow around them. And it was then that he realized that God was with him through the people in his church. Now, you don't really need to make a lot of commentary when someone, especially your brother, tells you something like that. I did think about how his story helps us to appreciate the deeper significance of the church and how God is still using the church in spite of all of its limitations and failures. Now, let me just say one more thing, and I'll quit. There are moments around here at Messiah when I watch the way you love one another. And I think I see a glow.